Yeah, so hi, I'm Jennifer. I'll be telling you about a new way to find features using the empirical NTK. This is based on this paper I've put on the archive earlier this month. Right, so first of all, the problem we're trying to answer is right in MacInterp, we'd all like to understand how models represent features. Right, namely models at the end of training seem to learn to represent constituent properties of the data that they then use to make decisions at inference time. I guess operationalized by the fact that we can then fine-tune models or train linear probes on their activations to classify these constituent properties with much better performance than from a random starting point. And we'd like to understand exactly how models represent features by ideally finding functions of their activations and weights that can detect given features with high sensitivity and specificity. The problem is it's a priori quite unclear how to guess a good candidate answer, right? Modern models have like trillions of parameters and like a billion neurons and like some combinatorially even larger number of composite degrees of freedom we can build out of them. And I guess the practical thing people have done in this field so far is just kind of make a guess about what kinds of degrees of freedom might represent features to narrow this hypothesis space. In like the very early days of MacInterp, like 5 years ago, like people collected data under the hypothesis that maybe single neurons are what map to individual features. Right, we now think this isn't generically true. With SAEs, we have a larger hypothesis that we assign features to linear combinations of mostly within layer neurons. But as Logan and others discussed, this too is a guess. It has some issues. So could there be other more principled candidates? And one strategy is we might hope to find an answer by looking at theory. If deep learning theory was powerful enough to give us a compact closed form formula for the function learned by any neural network at the end of training, right, maybe that formula would kind of automatically hand us the natural composite degrees of freedom to interpret. Right. So unfortunately, that's the hope. Unfortunately, in 2025, we're very far from having a complete theory for the function learned by a neural network everywhere in parameter space. Among the theories in 2025, the neurotangent kernel, the NTK, and kind of its generalizations and cousins are the only class of theories I know of that give us a complete closed form formula for the function learned by a neural network in a very specific regime. Namely, for models in a lazy limit, where the change in the total change in the network parameters throughout training is parametrically small, you can show that an MLP trained with MSE loss and gradient descent has the closed form solution of doing kernel regression. That's the first formula here, where the index I runs over the output neurons and alpha runs over the data points. With a kernel called the NTK, which is the second formula. So what is this NTK? Well, as it's a kernel, so it takes pairs of data points to a number, and we build it by contracting all the components of the Jacobian evaluated on the two data points. Yeah, so again, this is in this very special case, we do have this closed form formula. This footnote at the bottom, I explain how you derive it for people who haven't seen it before. Okay, hopefully this will stay on. Yeah, so the way we derive it is we Taylor expand a neural network after a step of gradient descent in the change in its parameters, and then using this this lazy assumption, we truncate to linear order, and we can then use the definition of gradient descent to replace DW, and at this order as possible to sum over all the steps of gradient descent. So it's kind of a very naive thing to do. Now, realistic models usually are not in this lazy regime. And indeed, in the lazy regime, you can show that in a technical sense, there's no feature learning. However, it's been subsequently conjectured and empirically checked in some cases, although we don't know in general when this idea isn't true, that perhaps kernel regression with the NTK evaluated at the end of training instead of at initialization may at times be a good approximation to the function learned by a neural network, even beyond the lazy limit. So this is called the empirical NTK hypothesis. The evidence for it is fairly patchy. It's like some motivations from theory, some empirical evidence, and I kind of comment on it in these footnotes. I guess one piece of theoretical motivation is if we take that Taylor series and where we expand the function in the weights and expand to quadratic instead of linear order, you can resum to quadratic order use through this like very heroic calculation in this book by these people that took like 400 pages. And the resulting solution in some regimes is dominated by what looks like kernel regression with a kernel that's the average of the NTK at initialization and the empirical NTK. Maybe more convincing is there was also some empirical evidence. A number of authors showed that the ENTK can match the performance of the full model in modestly sized MLPs and CNNs. On the other hand, the scaling law for the ENTK seems shallower than the full model, so it's probably not going to be a good approximation everywhere. In language models, people haven't done much to test this global hypothesis, but they have shown that if you do regression with the ENTK as like a proxy for fine tuning, it's a pretty close proxy on a bunch of realistic tasks. So I think there's right. So we don't know if this hypothesis if this ambitious hypothesis is true, but the empirical NTK does seem like a potentially interesting object, whether you buy the full hypothesis. So just taking that kind of as the backdrop, like the starting point, in this talk, what I want to do is take the relevance of this ENTK seriously without necessarily committing to the full hypothesis, at least take seriously the idea that it's an interesting object reflecting non-trivial structure in learned models, and see if it can be helpful for interpretability. And concretely, I'll test if the top eigenvectors of the ENTK align with ground truth features in a selection of common toy benchmarks where these ground truth features are known. And the punchline is that we'll find the answer is yes. In toy models up to modest rotations, indeed, the top ENTK eigenvectors appear to align with ground truth features. So this is what I'm going to try to explain in the rest of this talk. This is just a quick slide on method before I show results. So the NTK is a size n by n matrix where n is the size of the data set, or the like the training set for the formula that's supposed to approximate the full model, or a test set that we can use as a proxy when we're doing interpretability. So to argue that a eigenvector of this object aligns with a ground truth feature in a toy model where the ground truth features are known, we can take its cosine similarity with a length and feature vector whose entries consist of that particular feature, like that neuron or what have you, that feature's activation on each data point. So this will give us a scalar for each eigenvector and feature pair. And to visualize how a selection of these eigenvectors align with a selection of features, we can render heat maps that will show this correlation across all the pairs. So that's what I'm going to show you in a second. And I looked at this in the toy models of superposition and MLP trained on modular arithmetic, and so I'll show you these results next. Okay, so first experiment, toy models of superposition. Maybe I should ask: are there any questions, or does the setup make sense? Okay, I'll keep going. So this first experiment is this famous toy model from, that people in the MacInterp community like, from a 2022 paper by Anthropic. In this experiment, we train a one-layer autoencoder with a smaller hidden layer size than the input and output size and tide weights, to reconstruct a synthetic data set consisting of vectors of length n, where the ith entry of each vector is going to be set to 0 with some probability s, that's a hyperparameter we pick, and otherwise randomly drawn uniformly between 0 and 1. And we train this autoencoder with a loss function that's MSE loss modified by a importance hyperparameter that makes different components of the data vector be of different importance for minimizing the loss. And this data set and loss function are meant to be like a very crude model of a real world data distribution, with each entry of the data vector meant to represent a different feature of the data set. So there's n ground truth features in total. And these hyperparameters S and I are meant to model the fact that features in the real world, can be quite sparse and be of quite different importance for achieving success at realistic tasks. Now, of course, this is a tremendously crude model, leaving out lots of things about real-world data we've been discussing, like correlations between features and hierarchy and so on. But this was the original motivation. And the motivation for the experiment for why we train this autoencoder on this data set was to see if a model can encode more features than it has neurons by encoding them non-orthogonally in the activations of the neurons. So I guess we've discussed this idea in previous talks today. This is testing superposition. And so this plot comes from their paper. They found the behavior is qualitatively different depending on the size of this of S. So when S is small on the left-hand side, and that's corresponds to when the features are dense, the model reconstructs the top M features only. But as S increases, moving towards the right-hand side, the model starts to reconstruct more and more features at the cost of encoding them non-orthogonally. So in the figure here, the proxy for whether the model reconstructs a given feature is the magnitude of the entry along the diagonal on the top row, and the proxy for whether the embedding is orthogonal to the other ones is the color coding in the second row. So black is non-orthogonal, yellow is orthogonal, or the other way around. Yeah, so that was their motivation. My motivation is a little different. Given that this toy model with these nice ground truth features existed, we'd like to see if for this type of model at any values of all the hyperparameters like M, N, and S, the eigenvectors of the empirical NTK at the end of training happen to line up with the ground truth features. And here are our results. So for models with 50 ground truth features and this importance hyperparameter 0.8, it looks the same for other ones. These are just some specific choice. Across different hidden layer sizes M and sparsities S, we find that the empirical NTK's eigenspectrum contains two cliffs that track the total number of ground truth features the model has and the number that the model is able to reconstruct, where the diagonal value exceeds some threshold. And moreover, we find that the eigenvectors of this empirical NTK align with the ground truth features, like in this kind of nearly one-to-one way in both the sparse and dense regimes. So in short, this idea of using empirical NTK to find features naively seems to work for toy models of superposition. There's some technical fine print that maybe I won't go into too much at the level of granularity in this talk. One is how we have to reshape the NTK to flatten the tensor into a matrix, and another is that there's a one parameter rescaling hidden in here to adjust for the fact that TMS uses a modified MSE loss, while the usual NTK derivation uses normal MSE loss. But you can ask me about these details later.
Are you assuming the original features are orthogonal? Since you're talking about eigenvectors, is that assumption that the ground truth features are orthogonal?
Yeah, the original features are just it's like your input vector is n-dimensional, and it's and each dimension is like supposed to represent a feature. It's an artificial model of data.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, so let me show you now the results for the modular arithmetic experiment. Right, so this modular arithmetic is like a hydrogen atom for interpretability, or we train an MLP to do modular arithmetic, and we find it has very nice interpretable features. So this experiment by now has been done by many groups. I use the conventions in this paper by Grama, who has an especially pedagogical presentation of kind of the learned function. So the setup is like for a fixed integer p, we're going to do the modular arithmetic. We're going to take modular arithmetic of. We build the data set consisting of the p-squared unique pairs of concatenated one-hot encoded integers from 0 to p-1. So these are the numbers we're going to add. So the inputs are length 2p vectors with 2 1s and zeros everywhere else. And we label them by the one-hot encoded sum of these numbers. So the length p vector with one entry that's 1 and 0 everywhere else. And we split this data set into non-overlapping train and test sets. And then we would train a one-layer feed-forward model with the 2p input neurons, p output neurons, n hidden neurons. That's the free parameter. And a quadratic activation function to learn this data set with MSE loss. And this very simple setup exhibits a phenomenon called grokking, where sometime after it reaches 100% accuracy on the training set, it very quickly goes from 0 to 100% accuracy on the held out test set, suggesting that it switched to learning a more generalizable representation of this underlying modular arithmetic algorithm. And moreover, in this case, we actually know the exact solution that's learned by the model after grokking. So after grokking, the model, to a good approximation, learns Fourier weights. These cosine of 2 pi k over p, cosine of 2 pi kb over p, where a and b are the input numbers, up to some phases that are random but satisfy this one constraint. Here, the indices a and b each run from 0 to p minus 1 over the two one-hot encoded entries in the input. Index q runs from 0 to p minus 1 over the output layer, and k runs over the neurons in the hidden layer. Right, so since we know the exact weights of this model to a good approximation, we also know the activations at every step. So when we give this model a pair of input integers a and b, the pre-activations of the neurons in the hidden layer are going to be you just multiply through by the weights. So there'll be sums of cosine of 2 pi k over p, cosine of 2 pi k b over p up to these phases. Henceforth, I'll call these the cosine a, cosine b feature families. And then if you keep propagating through the model, the second layer activations will be the sum of many terms of the form cosine of 2 pi k a plus b over p, cosine of 2 pi k a minus b over p. Henceforth, sum and difference feature families, along with more of the a and b type of terms. And the way the model implements modular arithmetic is that several combinations of these terms can be shown to cancel on average due to all these random phases. One particular combination survives on average due to the constraint on some subset of phases, and that combination acts as a modular delta function, and that enforces the solution a plus b equals q. So this is a completely solved model. So that's why we like to test new interpretability techniques on it. Yeah, so let's see what happens when we analyze the system with the empirical NTK. So as before, the first thing we can do is look at its spectrum at the end of training. And so for the plots in this section, I use p equals 29, n equals 512, but I also checked it for other values of p and other values of n, including a model that's less wide. Let's see. Yeah, and we find the spectrum at the end of training. That's the plot on the left-hand side. Contains two cliffs, each of which has size 56, which is 4 times the floor of p minus 2 for this value for this choice of p. So that's the left-hand plot. The middle and this figure I just pulled it from the paper. The middle and right plots are kind of an aside. They show the spectrum we get when we compute a layer-wise NTK, where we sum only over the components of the Jacobian with respect to the weights in one layer instead of all of them. And by doing that, we can see that some of this structure localizes to a particular layer, which could be interesting for other applications in the future. But for now, let's focus on the left-hand plot. So that's the spectrum for the full model, and it has these two very like these two cliffs that stand out, and each has the correct counting to contain two Fourier families. And the reason I say that is that each of these Fourier families, cosine of like 2 pi ka over p for different values of k, has a floor of p minus 2 distinct values of k, since when we go more than halfway around the circle, trig identities relate some values of k with others. On the other hand, each of these cosine families comes paired with a sine family that absorbs all these random phases in the solution. So each full family has a count of 2 times floor of P over 2. So each cliff contains 2 families, or has the right counting to contain 2 families. So far we haven't shown that that's actually what happens. So before we dive into that, one thing we can do is look at the time evolution of the spectrum during training, and when we do, we also see some interesting structure. So here the left-hand plot is the standard plot that demonstrates grokking for this experiment. This left-hand plot shows the train and test accuracy of this model over the training time. The blue line is the train accuracy, the orange line is the test accuracy. So you see that long after this model reaches 100% accuracy on the training set, at around epoch 90 for the hyperparameters I used, its accuracy on the test set goes very quickly from 0 to 100% as well. And the right-hand side shows the NTK spectrum at different training times. And in it, we can see that at the same time as grokking, the second cliff forms in the ENTK spectrum. It's between the green and red lines. The green line is epoch 80, and the red line is epoch 100. So this suggests perhaps we can use this as like a tool to track when phase transitions are happening in the model. Also, the blue line is the spectrum at initialization. And so interestingly, there we see that the first cliff is already present at initialization. And in the paper, I explain why this depends on the way the shift symmetry of the inputs is picked up by the NTK, which sees all the inputs at initialization and can then do some unsupervised organization of them even before it sees any labels. But in general, for interpretability, we also want the information from the labels. So I think this is kind of just a nice curiosity for this particular model. Okay, so going back to like what's actually contained in these cliffs, right? So we have this suggestive counting that the number of the size of each cliff matches the size of 2 Fourier families, but do the cliffs really contain these Fourier features? And they don't seem to right away if we do the most naive thing, where we just make a heat map between the eigenvectors were sort of handed from scratch and the Fourier features. That's the left-hand plot. So when you just like make the same heat map as for TMS, it looks like kind of a noisy mess. But one can show that if you take the 56 eigenvectors in this cliff and you rotate them, you can get a rotation of them to line up precisely with the A and B Fourier modes. And namely, if you pick an orthonormal basis in the cliff eigenspace by first sorting the directions with respect to how much they vary along one input axis, then sort the lowest varying half with respect to the other, that basis lines up perfectly with the Fourier modes. So in the paper, I described this exact algorithm I used to rotate the vectors, but I think for this talk, this is also kind of a detail. The point is we are able to crisply show that the span of the vectors in each of these cliffs and the span of 2 sets of Fourier modes is the same. Yeah, so this is for the first cliff. We can do the same thing for the second cliff, the one that appears at the grokking phase transition. And there we find that the rotation of the eigenvectors in the second cliff line up with the sum and difference Fourier feature families at the end of training. And moreover, these rotated eigenvectors become increasingly more aligned with the Fourier sum and difference families to either side of the grokking phase transition instead of aligning with them like discontinuously at the transition itself. So this plot is like the inner product between this rotation of the vectors in that cliff that I described in the paper and the sum and difference Fourier modes, starting from epoch 40, so way before grokking, to the end of training. And so starting already at epoch 40, you can see there's some like incipient alignment of these directions that become the second cliff at grokking with the sum and difference modes. Yeah, so those are my main results. So yeah, to summarize, we found some evidence that the ENTK can surface learned features across these 2 toy models that people like in the back interp community. hopefully this is a promising, if preliminary sign that maybe this ENTK can eventually be the foundation for a new interpretability algorithms also in more realistic models. Okay, this slide is a mess. It's that's how is this project related to the workshop theme? So I've been making this slide over the course of the workshop and adding words to it after everyone's talk. So yeah, it's a solid wall of text. Maybe I'll just read it out loud. So how this could be related to the RG? I guess one idea is that the truncation of the kernel, so this Eigen spectrum has a lot of structure. If you truncate at one of these cliffs, it gives a natural emergent notion of coarse graining. Right. Remember, the original motivation for the NTK was that it can be used to build a conjecture approximation to the exact function that the model learns at the end of training. If we keep only the top eigenmodes of the sum cutoff, we get a sequence of increasingly coarse-grained approximations to the model itself. If you believe the original hypothesis, we're throwing out a relevant structure. And yeah, if you view these cliffs as kind of like natural emergent scales, it could be interesting to understand what the spectrum looks like in realistic models, and maybe we can make a safety case that nothing dangerous goes on like in the long tail of eigenmodes beyond like the cliffs that show up. I guess from a different kind of intramodel point of view, maybe if you think of the NTK as kind of a fixed point in model space, a better understanding of this kind of structure could help us understand when the analysis is motivated. So what I mean by that is so I guess from a certain point of view, you can think of the theoretical NTK as like a free fixed point for models in this lazy corner of the hyperparameter space, in the sense that like any models in that corner of model space trained on generic data and tasks will end up being described by this kernel regression formula with the frozen NTK after training. The ENTK hypothesis conjectures that the same formula with the ENTK instead of the theoretical NTK gives a good effective description for the function learned by a model on generic like data and tasks in a larger part of the model space. Right, so it would be useful to understand when this is true. And it would also be quite useful to understand if, in other parts of the model space, there are other effective descriptions for the function learned by a network at the end of training. Right, if we knew what that function looked like everywhere in model space, we'd probably have solved everything. That's probably very ambitious. Yeah, and then the future directions, I guess is kind of an obvious direction. Ultimately, our goal is to apply this technique to realistic models. And for this, it will be important to extend this pipeline to both transformer architecture and then increasingly large and realistic transformers. These are kind of two separate things that have to happen for this project to work, for it to generalize to transformers architecture and then to scale. Yeah, so I guess I unfortunately don't have much to say about this for now because I basically haven't thought about scaling. But I and maybe also Tom will hopefully get to work on this soon after this meeting is over. So maybe next time we all get together, I can tell you more about this. That's all I have to say. So thanks. Yeah.
Very basic question. So how is NTK computed from?
It's like you just take the model at the end of training and just very naively compute the exact formula.
Okay.
Yeah. That probably won't be good when you want to scale. So when you want to scale, you want to do some more approximates, like find the top eigenvectors without computing the full thing.
And how long do you train? Do you train to loss, to the minimum of loss?
For these models, yeah, but these are like one layer, very trivial models. So in these models, you can write down, you can both write down the analytic formula for the NTK itself, and you can compute every entry of this matrix and diagonalize the full thing. And probably neither of these things will work for larger models.
Yeah, the other issue with this is that as you, in addition to just how to compute the ENTK as you scale, it's this mapping of eigenvectors to features when you don't know the ground truth. So coming up with some unsupervised way to do that is
right. But
yeah.
That's the same issue with any technique.
Yeah, of course. But I was wondering if anybody has any Any idea?
Like, if you
Another thing to discuss.
because if in some model you have some existing features like SAE features or neurons or something, you can then do the same thing to compare with existing ones.
You just learned a rotation such that after rotation, things look sparse on your data set? Do you think, like, would that work in this toy setting? I think that would work as a way. Yeah,
You mean like could we have figured out how to do the rotation without kind of putting in by hand?
right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think something would like that would have worked in this setting. I think I have some footnote on that, but I have to remind myself what I thought about that. But
Okay.
Do you have any sense for how much the individual parameters typically change during like training of a large language model or versus one of these toy models?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but in both cases, it would be like outside. It would be far outside the kind of regime where the original theoretical formula works. Because in the origin in the kind of original theoretical formula, the leading term actually like rules out any feature learning, so it's very uninteresting. Let's see.
It's really cool. I think one thing I'm really curious on is like how this coheres with some of the like mode to mode, saddle saddle literature. So yeah, like Andrew Sachs has this conception that like in like the small initialization regime, that's kind of like a counter to the NTK. You have this like feature learning regime where you like learn, you know, the target distribution, just like sequentially through the particular modes. I think, yeah, like I guess that provides the way that I think about this kind of stuff is like that provides kind of like another regime within the model space. And I'm just very curious to like understand better how this like the NTK if the predictions of the like features cohere with like the predictions that we have in the regime, and then what happens in between these two regimes.
So that regime is when the initializations are small, but like the drift is large.
Yeah, when initialization is like very like near zero, so you're effectively initializing near a saddle point, near the origin, and then you have this whole thing about how signals propagate and whatever. But
what do you gain from small initialization? Is that solvable or?
I think the dynamics, there are some close form solutions for the dynamics. And what you end up getting, there's like a whole literature on the second.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this, and as well as like this mixed regime of like what happens when you're in the middle. Because I think that's like where maybe we have this mixture of like feature learning and kernel memorization.
Yeah, I think if there's any other like solvable or controllable regimes, it would be very interesting to interpolate. I'm not familiar with basically in like much of the literature or
Yeah, let's say we're interested in like theoretically understanding the learned function, like what kind of generalization you get. Like as you said on like your first slide for the NTK, we have like this explicit formula, right? And like in some toy models, we could like explicitly understand it. With Dimitri Weintraub, we have like thought through like what happens for Boolean functions, for example, with the NTK. But for the empirical NTK, like we understand given this like end of training empirical NTK, like what function, what generalization you would get, right? Then it's just this kernel regression. But like to understand like theoretically what happens during training, you also want to understand like what empirical kernel you get at the end of training. Like you want to understand, you want to model that process, I guess. And I wonder if you know about like if there's any like nice way to think about like the evolution of the kernel over training, like what theoretically like understand what kernel you end up with at the end of training.
So I mean that the approach of like following what happens to the kernel during training to get the formula at the end is kind of what people do in the theoretical NTK thing. Like there you can the reason we can get a formula at the end of training is because we are able to resum all the steps of gradient descent, and then you can also stop the sum anywhere in the middle.
Yeah, but if you don't make the assumption that gives you the usual NTK, you like wanna do like the more more correct, like the empirical NTK thing where it might be different at the end of training.
Right. So I mean, in the empirical case, we don't have control anywhere. Like we don't have control at the end either. It's a guess at the. It's also a guess at the end that happens to
Right.
work sometimes.
But is there like not? Is there some like way to think about what happens to the kernel during?
Oh, you
training?
mean to be just like look at the. You can look at if you can empirically look at the kernel itself and how that evolves during training, and that was kind of like what that looked like for the eigenvectors was one of the slides I show for modular arithmetic. Yeah, so I guess empirically, like certainly you can look anywhere among training. Theoretically, we basically have no control that I know of outside of doing this perturbation thing. I did briefly mention you can sum the perturbation thing beyond the linear order, and kind of see that the quadratic order like closed form solution interpolates a little bit between the theoretical and empirical. So that's like an interesting motivation, but that calculation like took an unreasonable amount of energy, and I don't know that you can push that any further.
I think there is like adaptive. I think maybe you would know more about like adaptive kernels. I don't know if it's necessarily. Yeah.
There is things that like DMFT dynamic theory that does like the adaptive kernels that we do is for the program, and then DMFT will tracks how like it evolves throughout training. There's a lot of things on that.
You have a last question?
Yeah, this is kind of separate from your use of the ENTK, but I'm curious to what extent the like regression prediction that you would get from the ENTK, like how that compares to just the actual trained model's prediction. Because the ENTK regression prediction is still going to be some Gaussian process for prediction, which for complicated models might be very different from the actual trained model prediction.
So you mean just how good the like that closed form formula with the NTK is on these particular models?
Yeah, like if you do K inverse.
Yeah.
Formula with ENTK.
Yeah, for the TMS model, I checked explicitly that it's quite close in the ones I tested. I didn't check it for the arithmetic one.